Uh, you.
Yes. Okay. I have some microphone problem here. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. This is our third meeting of our project, Literary Talks, in which we talk about literature. And today we are receiving a very special guest, Chinelo Onwualu. She is going to be here talking a little bit about or answering some questions for our students. And we are going to, I'm not going to be like spending a lot of time doing that. I'm going to give the word to Maria Eduarda, who will present our guest, say a little, some things about her. And after that, they will start asking the questions. So I hope you have a great meeting. Thank you for being here with us, Chinelo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Eduarda, and I am here with my group, Kael, Michele, Maria Gabriele, and Matheus, undergraduates from Letras course in UFMS, and we are here on Literary Talks to interview a great writer today. Today we have the honor to interview Chinelo. She's a Nigerian writer, editor, journalist, residing today in Toronto, Canada. Welcome, Chinelo. It's our pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, again, we are very honored to have you here with us today. So, to start, I would like to ask you a bit about your journey as a writer. So, can you tell us about that journey? Can you tell us about your journey as a writer?
Um, so it's a very funny thing being a writer because sometimes you don't always feel like a writer. I think writers are some of the most nervous people when it comes to their own writing. I've always liked writing. I've written since I was a child, but I didn't start publishing my writing until about 12 years ago in 2012. And I struggled along for a long time with feeling like I should write what I wanted to write. I write speculative fiction. So I write science fiction and fantasy and horror. But when I started writing, that wasn't something that a lot of African writers were doing, at least not in the way we understand it now. So when it comes to writing, when I was growing up, it was expected that you would write literary things. So I don't know if you guys have heard about Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. He's one of the most famous Nigerian writers, and everyone, I guess, expected that if you were going to write, you would write like him, and you'd write about politics um, and women's rights and things like that. And so when I started writing, wanting to write things like dragons and unicorns and ghosts and spirits was seen as kind of a waste of time. Um, and I struggled with that for myself. I still do, to be honest. Um, and I still struggle with the idea of whether I have written enough. And so my writing journey has been a journey of learning to honor what I write and learning to um, be proud of what I write because it has something to say in the world. Um, my first short story collection, the first anthology that I was in, came out in 2012. And my most recent anthology that I was in came out earlier this year. So I've had, something published just about at least once or twice a year, sometimes up to 4 times a year. And it's still, I still struggle to think of myself as a writer. So I would say that my journey is still going. And I hope just to continue to be able to write for as long as I can.
And you should be proud because your work is impressive. I find speculative fiction a very interesting genre, and I would like to ask you, how did you first become interested in that genre?
So I think I've always been interested in speculative fiction. I think I have always, I know I have always liked stories about traveling to space and, um, the supernatural. In Nigeria and in a lot of places in Africa, we don't see much of a separation between real life, quote, the idea of real life, and the spiritual. So if you talk to any African, they will tell you a story of an encounter with a spirit, with a ghost, with witches, with magic, and it doesn't feel to us like fiction. It is part of the way we understand the world and the way we understand stories. And so the challenge for us has been, for many of us, has been taking what we know for ourselves to be how the universe or the world works and presenting it to a Western audience that sees it as, oh, this is folklore, or this is um, that takes this information and dismisses it as evidence that we are backwards or we are, not civilized. And so that has been for many of us and many in this genre to take ourselves seriously in it. Um, I think that there is a huge difference between what is being published today and what was being published 10, 15 years ago. There are so many African writers now writing speculative fiction. We have magazines dedicated to it. We most recently, a Nigerian was nominated for some of the highest awards in the genre. Like I think uh, we've won Locust Awards, we've won Hugo Awards, and so I think it's definitely being taken a lot more seriously than it used to. But there's still so many challenges because there are so many stories and so many writers out there, especially people who are not living in the diaspora, in the African diaspora, and they don't get the same access. They don't get the same opportunities to publish. And so I think there's still a long way to go, but we have made so much progress.
And that's really nice. And I bet that you get to influence these new authors coming up. And I would like to ask you about your influences. Like, could you share some of your favorite authors or works that have influenced your writing?
I think early in my writing, I was influenced by some of the classics. So, um, Ursula K. Le Guin is someone that I would say was a very big early influence for me. Um, Her book, Left Hand of Darkness, really, really just shaped a lot of the way I think. Um, in terms of African speculative fiction, I would say Nnedi Okorafor was one of my earlier influences as well. She's somebody that I've always looked up to. Other writers include Nalo Hopkinson, who is a Canadian writer, and N.K. Jemisin is also someone that I really look up to. Um, in terms of my earliest writing, it's funny, a lot of people cite Octavia Butler, but I didn't come to Octavia Butler until I was an adult. And when I did, she really blew me away. So those are some of my biggest influences. Um, Included in that are Stephen King. I read a lot of Stephen King growing up. I read a lot of Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That series is so good. I have quite a few. I could be here all day if I had to name them all, but I think those are definitely some of my biggest ones. Stephen King really showed me how to tell stories in a way that is propulsive and flowing and movement focus. Nnedi Okorafor taught me that like I could reach into my own background and history, and that was a legitimate thing. Um, People like Octavia Butler and Nalo Hopkinson also showed me that it's okay to paint pictures that might be difficult or painful, to reach into those hard places to write. And Ursula K. Le Guin was fundamental in showing me that there were so many other ways to tell the stories that I'd seen on screen. And to each of these people, I owe so much. Oh, Ben Okri, his book, The Famished Road. Yeah, also one of my influences. So that's a lot of people. But yeah, those are all some of the people that I would say are my foundations.
Last year, I got to read some of Octavia Butler's work, and she's amazing. She's amazing.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah. Her book Wild Seed is still one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah,
All-time favorites. Yeah.
it's great. And what themes or ideas inspire your writing the most? And how do you think they connect to your cultural background?
Um, I think a theme, one big theme I come back to in my writing a lot is family relationships. So the ways that we relate to ourselves within a family, and the ways that family members relate to each other. I think relationships are a very key part of my writing. Very often they are exploring relationships. They are set within family units. Um, One thing that has also come up is trauma, and how characters deal with trauma, especially in situations that are otherworldly. So that's something I seem to come back to a lot in my writing. I don't know why. Um, yeah, and I think it's related to my cultural background because growing up, at least growing up in Nigeria, family is everything. You know, my mom used to have a saying that anybody can abandon you, but your family will always be there. And that can be true even when your family is broken and damaged and dealing with trauma from war and colonialism and genocide. And those relationships can be so thorny and tricky, and but they make us, they make us who we are. I don't know I don't know any writer who you'll talk to who doesn't have some story of something in their own family background that has made them the writer that they are today. And that goes for me too. So it's something I often come back to. I often explore the relationship between parents and children, the relationships between siblings, the relationships between people, families who have been torn apart and come back together. I find that is where my stories come from. Those are the emotional spaces that my stories come from. And I think it's important because when I compare my life here in Canada versus my life in Nigeria, my life in Nigeria was so grounded in family. It was so grounded in cousins and uncles and aunties. And that, even though I lived in a city that wasn't my hometown, I still had family everywhere. They, any market I went to, there was my one of my mom's friends I can stop by and talk to. I remember getting into a bus one day on a multi-city trip, and one of my uncles was there. It's just this sense of connection and safety almost, because everywhere you turn, there's somebody somewhere that has your interest. That's not to say that families are perfect, that families don't hurt each other, that families don't do a lot of damage to each other. I think the challenge is always when you are within these systems, whether it's the family that you were born into or the family that you made for yourself in terms of your friends, your spouse, your children. Those are the relationships and the systems that nurture you, that grow you, that help ground you. Without them, I don't know that we can fully be human.
And that's beautiful. And I think that writing about family is a way to connect with the readers because everyone has a family, as you said,
Right?
maybe a biological one or maybe a chosen one, but everyone has a family.
Mhm.
And now I would like to ask you a personal question because some of us might be writers one day because we study literature, and
Hmm.
something that I find very challenging is ending a story. So
Oh.
I would like to ask you, how do you know when the story is finished? Do you have a particular editing process?
So, you know what's really, really messed up? I had a problem with endings until I realized that this only came to me very recently. So let me make that clear. I didn't always know this. But before you start writing, have an idea of your ending. Because if you don't, and that's not everybody, that's not a rule. Till today, Stephen King will just start a book or a story and he doesn't know how it's going to end. He's as surprised as everyone else. But what often happens, and what happens with so much of my writing, is that you have these rich beginnings that are like so interesting. And then as you're going, you're like, oh, I have to end this. I'm going to have to end this. Oh, no, I'm going to have to end this. And then you just, okay, end it. And so what I'm learning very slowly and very painfully is that sometimes I need to have at least an idea, an inkling, a sense of where the story is going to end up. And even if the story doesn't get there, and even if the characters do something that surprise the heck out of me and take the story in a completely different direction, I will know that I was going over here and maybe I've ended up over here, but I did have a destination. Um, Something I'm doing for the first time is mapping out a story and saying, here are my major beats that I want to hit. I'm learning that from writing scripts. So with a movie script, before you ever sit down and like write the first scene, you have had to have this thing plotted out, beat for story, beat for beat for beat, before you even sit down. Um, People will ask you for the beat sheet. They'll ask you for the outline. Um, and you have to have all of that figured out before you write your script, right? And so I've been applying that to my writing. I think the reason why I haven't been able to truly finish a novel is because I don't know how to end them. And and I write this thing and I get to this point and I'm like, this is pretty good. I'm gonna stop here. And it's a short story, right? I also suffer from I actually used to be a journalist, and one thing that journalism taught me was be very economical in what you're saying. So if you can use 5 words to say something that could take 10 words, use 5 words. And that also led me sort of to the way I write stories. If if there's a satisfying ending after 10,000 words, that's where I'm going to stop. I'm not going to pack on 50 more thousand words just to have 50,000 words extra, even though that might be the start of a novel. Like, if I've gotten to a satisfying place, a place in the story that makes me go, that's when I usually know I've hit my ending. But for me, I am learning very painfully, very slowly, that before I start writing, I need to have an ending. Otherwise, I will abandon the story. I will not finish it. I will start it and wander off and do something else. So I need to have an ending, or at least a sense, an idea. Yeah.
Hello, Chinelo. Good
Hi.
morning.
Good
My name
morning.
is Mateus. It's so nice to see you talking about how to end in a story because I often found this problem like when I'm writing, I don't know when I can stop or not. So it's really nice that you share with us today. But you mentioned earlier with Kael about the magazine, and you're also known for Omena magazine. And we would like to know what led you to found Omena magazine.
So the story of Omena is really my co-founder Mazi. So after we both attended a writing workshop, we realized that we were one of the few people in that room who wrote speculative fiction. Um, n- Not just that we were one of the few, but there were so many of us who were also there, but we didn't feel like there was anywhere that we could publish our stuff. And Mazi is the kind of person who, my co-founder Mazi Wu, um, he works for the BBC. He's very like, if he has an idea, he just goes out and does it. I can sit with an idea and play around with it, and but I never get around to it. So he was like, if you will edit the magazine, I will create it. And so he did. He put the website together. He gathered all the resources, and I showed up and started sending emails to writers I knew and liked. And next thing the magazine was off the ground. Um, I did that for about 4 or 5 years, and when things kind of got a little too much for me, and I wanted to focus more on my writing, I was able to step back and hand it off to uh, Diana Ikwabasi, who Equal Diana Abasi, I mean, who has been an absolutely amazing manager and editor. Um, so really, the story of Omenana was one in which people who were sort of, we knew that more there were more people who were writing speculative fiction, who loved speculative fiction, but they just didn't feel like they had anywhere that they could take their stories to. They didn't have a place where the editors would take them seriously. A lot of them were already writing literary fiction because that was what sold. Tendai Huchu is one great example. He had, I think, 2 or 3 books of literary fiction. And when he saw our call, he was like, hey, I have this short story that is pure speculative fiction. It's time travel. Do you guys want it? I was like, yeah, send it to me. And after that, he's written, the last 3 books he's written have been all speculative. And he has always said that he needed that legitimization to take himself seriously. And I think that that was the case with so many people, is that we had this genre that we loved, that we were writing in secretly, but we didn't feel like it was legitimate because there wasn't anywhere for us to publish. So being able to have that space and provide that space for people, and not only that, but having an editorial eye that understood the cultural background that many people were coming from, that was willing to take the time. I would go through three, four, five drafts with people just so that I could make sure that they were getting as much support as they could. And nobody else was doing that. So I think providing that space was really, really important. I think it still is because Omena is still publishing. Um, and there are others, there are other magazines too. And so, yeah, that was kind of the story behind it. We saw a need, and Mazi was brave enough and had enough energy and focus to actually sit down and get it done and get people, and get and put the space together. Um, and that's really the story there.
That's so nice to be able to provide that space for authors. And I want to ask you, what was the feeling of seeing its first edition?
Man, it was wild. It was wild because that first edition was entirely solicited. I contacted all my friends who I knew could write. I was like, okay, you're bringing me a story. Okay, you remember that one story you showed me? I need it in this magazine. And they were like, okay, fine. Okay. Um, and we got an amazing illustrator to do the cover. It, it was such a, it was so it was so fun. It was so exciting. It was at the time, it was some of the most fun I've had doing a literary project, just because I got to work with my friends. I got to, read really cool stories and put them out there for other people. Um, it was a lot of work. And at the time, I didn't realize I had ADHD. So it was a lot of juggling things that I didn't know I was juggling. Um, but every single time I put out an edition, I felt this like I've learned now it's called a glimmer. This like sense of like this, it's like a little light going off in your head, like somebody sprinkled glitter all over your head. And I still feel that way with it. I don't know if I can describe it. Each time I got to put out a story I loved, each time an author whose work I admired found themselves in our magazine, it really felt like I was doing something good in the world. And that feeling is not very common. And when you find a project that gives you that feeling, yeah, you hold on to it, for as long as you can. And yeah, and that was what Umenana was.
It's so nice. You mentioned the illustrations, and I saw them, and I was in love with all of them. The illustrations are so amazing. I love it. I
They're pretty
know,
good.
I know it's probably hard for you to answer this question, but do you have a favorite edition of a Menona magazine?
Ooh, that is hard. I can't say that I have a favorite edition. I have lots of stories that still stay with me. Um, in particular, stories that I would have loved to have taken, but they weren't quite there yet, and I hope to see them come back to the magazine, and they didn't, or I found them elsewhere. And um, there have been stories that still stick with me that I still think about. And I can't say. It's like asking someone to say who's your favorite child. Like you can say, okay, I like the drive and ambition of my eldest. I like the spark and funness of my second, but you can't say yes. Well, if you do, you're not a very good parent. But no, but it would be hard to say. I can say like some of my favorite covers. I can say some of my favorite, stories. But I don't know that I can say what my favorite edition. I do know that some editions were harder to put together than others. Um, I think Omena X was one that was really fun because we got a grant for that, and we were able to publish 10 stories as opposed to five, and some really really amazing authors. I think every author in that edition was a first time, a debut author. And some of those authors I've gone on to see do other things, and others I'm like, man, I hope you pick up the pen again because you are very, very talented. So, yeah, I don't know that I have a single favorite edition. I do have some editions that were easier to put together than others. Um, yeah, sorry, I wish I could answer that, but I can't really.
Hi, good morning. So I bet it's very, very rewarding to see your magazine highlight African speculative fiction to the world. So how do you see the future of this genre in literature?
I think the future of the genre is it's just beginning. I think it's going to keep going. It's going to keep growing. It's going to keep having more voices. I I do have a concern sometimes that publishing goes through these phases where it's very interested in the voices of people who are women, who are um, minorities, who are queer. Um, and then, then it fades back out again, and then it fades back in, and then it fades back out. But what I'm seeing is with the growth of more, especially African writers in the genre, I can only hope that that will continue to grow. I have seen some trends where um, one thing gets popular and then publishers want the next thing that is exactly that one thing that was popular. Um, but I'm seeing more of a diversity of voices. I would love to see more voices from smaller African countries. There are a lot of Nigerians on the scene, and that's awesome because I'm Nigerian. But but it's really exciting when I see like voices from Botswana, from from Zimbabwe, uh, places that also need that representation. I would love to see more people directly on the continent being published. Um, right now, most of the African voices are people who are already in diaspora, so it's easier for them to get access. So I would love to see more people who are actually already based on the continent getting some of this attention. Um, there is a thriving publishing scene on the continent, but it's often limited within countries because it's harder to distribute books across the continent. There's a lot of infrastructure that isn't always there. But that's also changing with the internet. Now, people don't have to necessarily wait for something to come out in print and then ship that printed thing across, five different countries to get it from Nigeria to Ghana, for instance. Um, there's more print on demand options from India and China that have allowed people to get access to really good printed material. So I think, barring any unforeseen circumstances and um, any unexpected pivots, or so what I'm concerned about, I will share my hopes and now I'll share my concerns. I'm seeing a turn towards more conservatism in a lot of places. And these conservative voices very often want to close up these spaces. They want to push out women. They want to push out non white people. They want to push out queer people, trans people, and consolidate that power. And there is a fear that the corporate, right now, corporate interests see that there's still enough people in the world who are supporting this. That those people that want to close up the spaces are a minority. They are loud, but they're not many. And what I sometimes fear is that corporations will mistake loudness for numbers. So a small, loud group of people who want to really make things difficult for the rest of the world will find ways to make that happen. I still have a lot of hope that that is not the case, but I can also see scenarios where power and profit begin to take precedence over morality and fairness and um, and just plain curiosity. I'm always curious about what other people are saying and doing and other voices. Um, and the minority, the small minority that kind of want us to go back to this imagined past, I fear sometimes that because they are willing to do whatever it takes, they'll cheat, they'll lie, they'll destroy democracy, just to get their way. um, I sometimes fear that we are being too complacent and that we are too sure of our own rightness, that we're not fighting back hard enough. And not to say that we need to do the same things that they're doing, cheating and lying. Like, ultimately, that's you can cheat and lie for a little while and it will work for a little while, but it's not a long-term strategy. But in the short term, it can do an enormous amount of damage. And I fear sometimes that we are not taking that threat seriously enough. We are not shutting it down as soon as we see it. We're not seeing just how powerful it could be if we don't take action. And so when it comes to the future of the genre, right now it's a small minority making a lot of noise. But if we are not careful and if we get complacent, it can be a small minority taking over and shutting things down for everybody else. And that's the reality that we need to be aware of. It can happen much sooner and much faster than any of us expect.
It's so important to see you talking about these topics, and I hope that you know that you play a major role in speculative fiction, and you are inspiring a lot of us today. So really thank you for being here. And
Oh,
now I want to move a bit for other questions. And talking about your short story, What the Dead Man Said, which was selected as one of the best science fiction and fantasy books of 2019 by the Washington Post. So congratulations.
oh, thank
How
you.
did you come up with the idea or this short story?
So that story, like a lot of my other stories, was inspired by a dream I had, and a real event and a dream, actually. But mostly it was commissioned by the Arizona State University Center for Science and the Imagination. And those guys have been amazing in advocating for speculative fiction um, from Africa, because they have a center that is looking at the connections between speculative fiction and climate change, and how to use speculative fiction as a tool to inspire and move the conversation around climate change forward. So what's been very what happened with that particular story is that I had this idea that I'd been sitting on for a long time. I had this small excerpt that was the dream that it was based on. And when they contacted me, I was like, here's the kernel of an idea. Here's um, the subject you want me to talk about. I can bring these two things together. Um, that is a story that was pulled from uh, one of those difficult places inside you. And I think stories like that can be really hard to write because they mean you have to be vulnerable and you have to face ideas and scenarios that are really hard sometimes. Um, and I think in some ways that's what gives that story that like the power that it has, far beyond anything I wrote, is that it resonates, I think, with people. Um, there's like a real core of pain there that I think a lot of people resonate with, even beyond all the speculative fiction elements. Um, it's also it's one of my more personal because it's set in my hometown. And so I had to like kind of go back into my hometown and imagine its own future. So there's a lot there that, and I think it's one of the harder stories I've had to write, but it is also, I think that might be why it resonates with people. It's nice that it does, um, but I think maybe that's why.
Hello, Chinelo. I'm
Hi.
Maria. I read your his history, what the dead man said, and I love it. I love it. You bring such important themes to a fictional scenario. I love that. So the story addresses identity and futurism. How did you develop the idea of exploring these personal questions? And what message did you hope to convey exploring these topics?
So the the theme I was given to write on was, well, not given. So I was asked to write about a technology or a trend, and then project it into the future. And what I had chosen to write about was population. So at the time, there were a bunch of reports from the UN about how the population of sub-Saharan Africa was going to explode and continue climbing, 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 climbing. And the way it was presented was this sort of straight line up. Whereas when you looked at the population projections for other parts of the world, there was a more realistic projection of like up, then some plateaus, and maybe some ups, and maybe some dips. But for some reason, when people talk about Africa, they think what you see today is exactly what's going to be in 20 years' time and 30 years' time, no difference. So we're going to have poverty. Always going to be poverty. You know, there's going to be war, always war. And those kinds of projections, while I understand that it can be difficult to get some of the numbers you need on the ground, there's also an element of racism there that assumes that Africans, Black Africans in particular, their grandmothers had 9 children, so they'll have 9 children, so their children will have 9 children. Whereas the reality I see is that for most people, even across class, women are having fewer children. That is a trend that is being reflected all over the world. I remember when some of the initial numbers for Latin America came out, and it had similar projections of like constant population growth, when the reality was that within 10, 20 years, as many countries improved poverty rates, improved literacy rates, improved rates of women in the workforce, those numbers started to even out and go, in some cases even go down. Why wasn't the why weren't people doing the same for Africa? Why were people just assuming that Africa was the one exception to this global trend? Why? Um, and so when I sort of took that, what I know for my reality on the ground versus what is being projected by the system, whatever. Um, and I tried to flip it a little bit. And so I did some research about places that experienced population busts. So the idea is that when a population bomb is when you have so many young people born that when they get to working age, they start earning money, they start innovating, and they push their economies forward. If there is you know, something for them, if there's good educational opportunities, if there's work, um, and that population of young people can really, really push their economies forward. But what happens when you're expecting a lot of young people and then you don't have them? What happens to your population? What happens to your economy and all of that? And so I kind of brought, once again, two ideas and kind of brought them together. Um, the other side of it, so that was the science side of that story. The other side of that story was what happens when, even when you have economic growth, you're still dealing with traditional ideas of relationships, of what parents owe to their children, what children owe to their parents. What happens when there's such a huge fracture in a family, and we don't always have the tools to heal or fix? What happens to people in that situation? So you have, I think, like real life, you have your individual stuff that you're dealing with, and then you have the stuff that's going on in the world, right? And those two things are always happening at the same time. Even as your, country might be experiencing economic depression, you're still having to go to work and deal with your parents and fall in love and deal with your children. Um, you still have to study and pass your exams. So there's no reason why that wouldn't be the case in the future. And so for me, that story was really, how do you deal with grief, even as, all these good things and amazing things might be happening for your country and for your people. Yeah, and I think those are the two big ideas I was trying to carry at the same time.
That's so important. And talk about that. A fundamental piece of the narrative is the creation of new Biafra and the diaspora migration of characters. Can you share more about how you conceive this future world and the influence of fictional historical events on it?
So the idea of New Biafra isn't mine. The historical context for that is that in the 60s, in the early 60s, very soon after Nigerian independence, actually, I would say mid to late 60s, we had a lot of ethnic divisions in the country carried over from colonial systems of divide and conquer. So, what the colonial powers did was pit different ethnic groups against each other. And in the way, like after our independence, those divisions were still there, and they very quickly led to civil war. And what happened was that my ethnic group um, wanted to form an independent country called Biafra, and we wanted to secede from the Union of Nigeria. And that led to about 4 years of civil war, with a lot of atrocities committed. I think by today's standard, a lot of what happened would be considered genocide. Mass starvation of people, and and even though there was a formal, surrender and the war ended, a lot of those divisions never really went away. Um, and there was never a true process of reconciliation, just a collective agreement that we would forget what happened, that there was no victor, no, I believe the phrase was no victory, no defeat, or something like that. But what has happened is that without when you don't talk about it, that doesn't make it go away. Those wounds are still there. And there's a lot of political opportunism. A lot of politicians take the opportunity to use those divisions to gain their own power. And many people in my ethnic group still feel, and in some ways are discriminated against. Um, Definitely, even these days, there are still targeted violence against ethnic violence, where people of one ethnic group will attack another, drive them out of their homes, burn their shops. It's depressingly still going on. And so the idea of a state of our own has never really gone away. And I I I use that as kind of a political idea, not advocating, the breakup of the Nigerian Republic, but just seeing ways to just sort of play with the idea, see what it felt like on paper to have that. Um, so the context of that is that there is a real political movement that still advocates for separatism. Um, it is not exactly popular, but it keeps coming up. It hasn't really died away, that idea. Um, and I think sometimes when you have a minority that doesn't feel like its interests and its well-being is being taken very seriously by the rest of the country, you keep that kind of dream alive and going, and just keep thinking like, well, if only I could just leave, I'm sure whatever I make would be better. And that could be true and that might not be. It's hard to say. But I don't write reality, I write speculative fiction. So so this is something I can do, without necessarily like not carrying a Biafran flag or anything. But it was just a very interesting idea I wanted to play with.
Oh, that's amazing. So nice to know about how you develop these ideas for your history. So the last question is, another important role played in the history is the relationship between the protagonist and her later father. How did you approach building the relationship, and what's the relevance to the main character journey?
So anytime you have a difficult relationship with a parent, I don't I don't think that wound ever really closes. Um, some of that is watching a whole generation of men who were traumatized, or men and women who were traumatized by the war, went on to have children and families. without ever having the resources, opportunities, or space, even within themselves, to deal with that trauma. And the thing about trauma is that it doesn't go away just because you don't deal with it. Emotions don't dissolve just because you refuse to, acknowledge them. And if you don't play it out for yourself, you play it out for your children. Um, as a mom myself, I I am seeing all the ways all my unresolved stuff is now having to be dealt with because I have a child. And I saw that with my parents. I saw that with the parents of my peers, with parents in my extended family. And so in a lot of ways that parental relationship is a familiar one to me. Um, uh, and when you have traditions and so in Nigeria, the difference between my grandparents and my child within just 3 or 4 generations is so vast. The world my grandparents were born into and grew up in is unrecognizable to my child, or would be unrecognizable to me, even. So there's been so much progress, so much change, and we haven't always had a chance to deal with that change, to understand what it did to us. Um, and so we play it out in our families. We wound them, they wound us, we fight, we break, we come back. Um, and so the relationship between the protagonist and her father is one of two people who, wounded in their own ways, never really managed to get back together, never really managed to fix and repair things. And I think that's the reality of so many of us, and so many, not just in Nigeria, not just in my ethnic group, but across the generational divides in which your parents' reality is unrecognizable to you, their parents' reality was unrecognizable to them, and how do you continue to try and be a family with that, And so I think that's the question at the heart of that relationship. Because death is not always the end. Even if your parent has passed, you're still here and you're still there with your memories of them, who they were, what they did or what they didn't do. That doesn't go away just because one person has passed on. And so, having a literal ghost that you can have these conversations with can, that's part of the speculative part of it. But that conversation, that pain, all of that is real. And what I love about this genre is that I can take the real and spin it around with something that is magical or mystical or spiritual and still be talking about something that is real.
And that's really interesting. And I would like to ask you, because we are approaching our ending time, if you would like to answer a few more questions. We actually have four more questions,
Yeah.
and it will be
And there's
okay.
some people here that I haven't heard from. I haven't heard from Maria Eduarda. So, yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So, Michelle, please.
Okay. Another story that really got our attention was the fine print, and I read it, and I confess that I spent a long time for reflect about the short story. I really love it. Um, and you address issues related to desire and the consequence of fulfilled desires. Would you like to know what the spirit? inspired you to explore this topic?
So I found myself living in an insanely capitalistic society, right? Um, Not to say that Nigeria isn't capitalist, but the I didn't grow up with the internet. The first time I went online, I was a teenager, and I think there's a generation Gen Z. I think you guys have grown up with a sense of the internet, at least for most of your lives, right? Um, Encountering something like Amazon or any of these, systems that you can suddenly click a button and anything you absolutely want is right there in front of you. What does that do to you? um, what does that mean for your relationships, for the world when you can just have whatever it is you want? And when there's a system that is actively encouraging you to do that at the expense of almost everything else. So I think the fine print is me sort of trying to peel back the layers of capitalism to its most fundamental, like not just capitalism, but the kind of greedy, ever hungry capitalism that will take from everything and destroy the planet in the process just so you can have some nice plastic thing. Um, what is that? Why is that? What does that do to our relationships? What does that do to our sense of what we value? And that was just me sort of spinning around. Um, I wanted to take the idea of cheating a genie or a fairy. The story of Rumpelstiltskin. I don't know if you guys know that, of the guy who helps the princess spin straw into gold, and then demands her firstborn son when she has him, and his only thing is, if you can guess my name, then you can keep your kid. And to be absolutely honest with you, that felt like some of the contracts I've signed with like internet companies. Like, if you can guess how you can get out of this insane contract, then you don't have to pay all these thousands of dollars that we are going to charge you. I feel like the genie, the the trading away of your children, so much of it is basic. It felt like to be a talking about capitalism, not necessarily magic. And I kind of wanted to express that in that story. It is one of my favorites, to be honest. I think the genie is one of my favorite characters, just because he is a deeply malicious person, but he seems like he's going to give you everything you want. Um, so yeah, that's where that came from. It was just me sort of dealing with the shock of being in such an intensely capitalistic society.
I think this story is very important for our generation. And we all know that you are great in writing and you have been acclaimed for your innovation approach to storytelling. How do you decide to experiment with narrative structure in your short story?
Um, I don't know if that was okay. It was a decision because I tried writing other things and it just didn't work for me. One of the I think the hardest part of being a writer for me was and is deciding to remain true to what moves me, to what truly interests me. There are a lot of influences, a lot of um, pressure sometimes to write to write to what you think people want, to write um, in a way that people expect. So, and I've done that before. Sometimes I've gone back and taken out elements because I wanted this story to feel more grounded or realistic. Um, but that's been the challenge of writing for me, and I still struggle with it. Is writing what I feel I have to say for myself versus what I think people want to hear from me. And I think some of the best writing I do is when I close my ears to what I think people want, and focus on what it is I want and what it is I want to say. And sometimes I I'm sometimes concerned because some of what I have to say isn't always flattering to, you know, to people and systems. And, publishers might read some of my stuff and go, that's, uh, that feels like you're very angry at white people. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I kind of am. Or that sounds like you're, criticizing the government. Yeah, kind of am. And so it's still a struggle for me because I really want to write things that people like, but I also understand that what I write people will not necessarily like, and that is okay. That doesn't mean my work is bad. It just means it's not for that person. That's okay.
So I have two last questions for conclusion your chat. And are there any projects or upcoming works that you would like to share with your readers?
Um, Upcoming work. I Well, okay. Recently, I published a collection of essays by speculative fiction writers of color, talking about their writing. It's called Ex Marginalia. I'll put it in the chat for people. And it was published in February, so that was my most recent thing. Upcoming, I am working on a short story for an anthology that will be out in 2024, I think. Um, I'm also co editing an anthology of African ghost stories for a British press, and that will also be out in 2024. We are helping to put together, choose some of the stories right now, and that's coming out. I have a podcast launching with some my co-creators, Jenna Hanchi and Yvette Mlovu, and that is coming out in October. And it will be available wherever you can get and find podcasts, Spotify, Apple, wherever. And that launches next month.
Oh, it's so nice. For the last questions, what advice would you give to aspiring writers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, who are you looking to break into the speculative fiction?
I think the biggest advice I would give is to believe in your own voice. I still struggle with that. I still struggle to I still struggle with the idea that my writing is I want to say worthy, but not exactly. I struggle with the idea that what I have to say matters. I know it does. I believe it does, but I don't always have that here sometimes. Or I know here, but I don't always know here. Um, when you are a marginalized writer, there are so many messages from everywhere telling you that what you have to say doesn't matter, that that other voices are more important, that you are not as important as somebody else. And the challenge is to move through that, to um, to keep believing in yourself when it feels like no one else does. I when I see straight white men just sit down and just just throw the words onto the page so easily, I both admire and envy, and I get so mad because they don't seem to be struggling with a sense that their words, nobody might want to read what they say. They just assume, of course everyone's going to read what I want to say. I just have to write it. They don't struggle with a sense of legitimacy. Am I really a writer? Um, I don't see other people doing this. Is this really what I should be doing? Maybe I should be doing something else. And I think that having or being in the middle of a system where everything works to your benefit, you don't have to struggle with that. And so the biggest thing I would advise writers who don't have a whole system, set up just to make you feel good, you got to find those sources of not just inspiration, because everything inspires you, but sources of support are so important. Um, find people who believe in your work. Um, find people who believe in you and your legitimacy as a writer, who look at you and say, "Yeah, of course you're a writer." Even if they're people online that you've never met and never will meet, even if it's somebody whose work you like and you'll never be able to talk to that person, hold on to those things because they can be your anchors in a world that wasn't built for you.
So, Chinelo, thank you very much for talking to us today. I think that meeting the person, the voice behind the stories, is always an astonishing experience. For me, it's an amazing experience. And I'm very glad that we got to meet you today and talk to you and learn more about your work uh, as a writer.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really great. Thank you. You guys had great questions. And thank you so much for, I have to say, your English facility is so, so amazing. Each and every one of you. I just want to give you like you guys did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Chinelo. It was wonderful. Like we have so many things to think about now and to reflect. Later, we are going to like have conversations, I'm sure, and we'll be like going over this. And I'm sure asking people that weren't able to be here today to come and watch us later because definitely they are going to learn something and they are going to see um, a wonderful person that you are, and it's wonderful like just to spend some time here. It's very nice. I was in the backstage here just like wow, very nice.
Well, I
So
am
I
so
want to
grateful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I want to echo Kael in this thanking and all the group, of course, that I'm sure was very happy with your availability and with your way to interact with them, because they were a little afraid, a little insecure. Like, what if she speaks like very fast and we don't understand what she's saying? But I'm sure like you were so calm, and you were speaking like so slowly that everybody could understand, and that was wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. You guys are great. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
And I would like to thank our audience too. They didn't ask, like, they didn't interact very much asking questions or anything, but the group had lots of questions, so it was wonderful. And I want to invite people for next week. We are going to have a section. It's not going to be on Monday morning, it's going to be on Wednesday afternoon. And we are going to have Marge Piercy with us to talk a little bit about her work. And it's going to be her first, like the first time we talk after we published here her novel that I translated, Woman on the Edge of Time. So it's going to be an interesting conversation too. So next week we have our next meeting. Thank you so much, Chinelo, again. Thank you, group, for the questions. And that's Literary Talks.
Thank you so much.
Bye
Take
bye.
care. Bye.